Good evening. I am so excited to be at work this evening in a place that I know all too well. I do want to say that as I was listening to you read my bio and you were talking about all of those degrees, you were talking about how much investment I put into myself. I was thinking about how many student loans I owe. And I looked in the pew, and there's a little envelope there for prayer requests. And I know this may be a space in which we need to be apolitical, but I started to put a candidate's name that I needed to be elected so we can get those student loans forgiven. In Jesus' name. I am so excited and honored to be here. I want to thank you so much for this gracious invitation to Brian, the Reverend Dr. Brian Henderson, our executive director, Natalie Ho, Dr. Laura Levins. Thank you so much for that gracious introduction and for your hospitality. To Bob Sittig, to also James Rice, who I had the opportunity to meet upon entering, our honoree for this evening. And I do want to acknowledge someone who paved the way for me to do what I am doing in pastoring. I have been in a season of grief, remembering my grandmother who has gone on to be with the Lord. But one of the things that she taught me is that it is important to say thank you to those persons upon whose shoulders you stand. I want to acknowledge the Reverend Dr. Clifford Matthews Jr. Will you help me acknowledge him? In my community, as an out African American male pastor of a historic Black Baptist church, the work that I am doing is because of the courage that he stands upon and stood upon. And so I want to acknowledge him. I also want to acknowledge my husband. I know you acknowledged him when you introduced me, but my grandfather used to say a poor dog won't wag his own tail. He just turned 40 on Friday. And so we've been celebrating all weekend. Tyrone, will you wave your hand? I love him very much. Thank you. And then one of our virtual members, who he was a youth minister, youth member when I was a youth pastor in Atlanta years ago. He's here with us. Jay, will you wave your hand? So excited that Jay is here visiting from Atlanta. Amen. So this evening, I am not going to lecture on my book. I am going to lecture on the book that I am writing now. I have, the Spirit of God has been speaking to me again, and sacred ghosts have been haunting me from the grave, and so I write. I write because I am possessed to by the Spirit of God. I write because I am possessed to by the spirit of Black LGBTQIP+ ancestors who won't let me sleep at night until I share their stories. This next book, the first book, was to the heteronormative church, but the second work is actually about spaces that have been carved out by Black queer folk. During the Q&A, I welcome questions about the book that I just published, but tonight I want to take you on a journey through this new book that I'm writing for the New York University Press. I'm going to title this talk, Voices in the Wilderness, an introduction to Black queer hermeneutics and homiletics. This year, I published a book titled Queering Black Churches. The book provides a practical theological framework for dismantling heteronormativity within African American congregations. Although churches with homophobic views are invited to read my book, the book is primarily aimed at helping open and welcoming congregations that are committed to becoming affirming congregations, but are just unsure of how to accomplish such a complex feat. Drawing on the experiences of several historically Black churches that became open and affirming, My book explores how certain black congregations queered their ecclesial context. I examined the similarities and differences in their approaches and synthesized them into a methodology that I call black ecclesial queering. Black ecclesial queering is an approach to dismantling homophobia and transphobia that moves beyond the performativity of surface-level allyship and toward an intersectional notion of structural renovation and individualized soul crafting that breathes new life into the souls of black churches, black church folk, black transgender Christian folk, and black queer Christian folk. However, this attempt at winnowing ecclesial colonialism and black heteronormativity is merely one chapter in a movement that is far more extensive than my first book. The burgeoning fields of black queer religious studies, black queer theory, black queer theology, and black queer ecclesiology moan and groan for more. Most, if not all, of the works in the first wave of black queer theology, which I'm even including my work, were written in sacred protest and holy rage in response to Christian homophobia. But now the field implores a second wave of black queer theology and theory that yields more than just toxic apologetics and argumentative theological reasoning crafted by the tools of white empire to white empire. As black queer theologians, it is now time for us to write about our own hush harbors or spaces that are FUBU. I don't know how many of you remember the brand called For Us, By Us, meaning that it was for black people and created by black people. And I am ready for queer theologians, especially black queer theologians, to stop speaking to the mainline church and to start writing about our own damn spaces. Yes. This means developing not merely a theology that seeks acceptance, but crafting black queer theologies that serve and originate from black queer individuals and communities themselves. What I'm pushing our field to do is much like the moves of black feminism and womanism, borrowing from the works of Alice Walker. The second wave of black queer theology must do more than talk about dismantling heteronormative spaces. It must work to help black queer persons to celebrate the God within us that is us. We must write about how black queer Christian folk have come to know God outside of the churches of their birth. A God whose image and likeness is beyond gender and male descriptors. A God of and for black queer folk who is for them, us, and who cannot be limited or boxed in by oppressive cultures or degenerative theologies. This is the type of God that we need black queer theologians to start writing about instead of bowing to the white guilds to which they are a part. A God of the oppressed is what we need, extending the argument of James Cone. When I asked him as a student at Boston University, why did he not include LGBTQIAP+ individuals in his writing, he said in his voice that was very noticeable, "I did my part, you do yours." And so it is time for us to do our part and extend his argument to talk about a God who tabernacles with black queer flesh. A God who is shrouded in a familiar earthly tent, signifying the sacredness of our flesh by joining in with the fellowship of our suffering and drinking from our bitter cup. This is the foundation of all black queer theologies and ecclesiologies. To understand this theology's impact, we must begin with a brief look at the histories of these churches and their founders. From a historical perspective, black, queer, and transgender preachers and believers have founded over 1,000 black churches over the last 40 years. Horace Griffin, a dear friend of mine, in his book, Their Own Receive Them Not, argued that an increasing number of black queer folk are responding to black church homophobia in a way that parallels the black AME Church's Richard Allen, who left white Methodism to start the AME denomination because he was told he was not welcomed. In the same way, queer people are leaving black congregations where they experienced denigration and are forming their own black gay churches. In his 1980s article, well, before I get there, an example of some of these preachers would be, first of all, the Reverend Elder Darlene Garner and Reverend Dolores Berry, both influential black lesbian women who played pivotal roles in the ministries and founding of affirming black churches. There's also the Reverend Dr. Renee McCoy, a trailblazer who established the Harlem Metropolitan Community Church in 1981, the first MCC church entirely governed by black queer individuals. Additionally, in 1989, she founded the Full Truth Fellowship of Christ Church in Detroit. However, in 1982, after gaining tenure, in 1989, she went on to retire from pastoring the Full Truth Fellowship Church in Detroit. This is a snippet of black gay churches that have been started by black queer folk. In his 1980s article, Why a Black Gay Church, the Reverend Dr. James Tenney, a prominent expert on black Pentecostalism at Howard University, who was almost denied tenure and excommunicated from the Church of God in Christ after coming out. And I will say that I just want to pause here to say one little tidbit about James Tenney. He founded what I argue to be one of the first black gay churches in the United States, but it is questionable if he was actually black or not, which may have been the reason why he didn't initially get tenure at Howard, because they perceived him to be a white person trying to get tenure at an HBCU. But the truth is that he was queer, and it was probably homophobia that really prevented him from gaining tenure. And my argument is, after spending a great deal of time in the archives at both Morgan and at Howard trying to find information about Tenney, even looking in his records, going back through Ancestry.com, he did possess the one-drop rule. And if in this country a person chooses to identify with that one drop when they are passable, I think that is something to acknowledge and to at least pause and to think about. And so that's for those black queer scholars in the room who may be saying, why are you basing this on a white man? Well, I'm using the one drop rule here. And so Tenney wrote an argument, and he wrote a reason for black queer churches. He started a revival in Washington, D.C. in the 80s, which led to him founding an actual church. He wrote these words: "Black lesbians and gays have often found themselves caught in the middle, so to speak, in the two-ness of identity. The black gay or lesbian person did not fit into the landscape of black churches. And they did not fit into the white, gay, and affirming church context either, because being both black and gay was not wholly approved in either the black heterosexual or white gay communities. In worship, black queer folk have to choose between being black or LGBTQIAP+, but never both. This is why black queer churches were founded, and like HBCUs, why black queer churches are needed." As a continuation of Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas's Sexuality and the Black Church, I predict that the next wave of Black theological and ecclesiological research needs to focus on these churches that have been founded by Black queer folk, because one of my arguments is just as prior to Reconstruction, all of the Hush Harbor churches that enslaved folk worshiped in have not been documented, and their histories have not been documented because there were so many. And when Reconstruction took place and enslavement ended, and the Black church was now operating under the auspices of the white gaze, the ones that actually survived were the ones who were connected with major white denominations that funded them often. And so we have lost the history of all of those churches. My argument is that as more churches hopefully begin to queer their ecclesial context, Black churches, that we're going to see a death of these churches that have been founded by Black queer folk, because my research also yields that a lot of Black queer folk that are in Black churches that have been started by Black queer folk actually want to be in Big Mama's church, but they settle to be in an affirming church because they can be themselves. And so they are just waiting on some of the more traditional Baptist churches to be affirming so that they can reunite with the churches of their origin. And so what I want to do as a sort of religious historian of this context and era, I want to make sure that I catalog all of these churches. I have a running list now of about 1,000, a little more. What's sad is that the majority of these churches only existed for about 42 months. We saw a huge, drastic number of decline of the existence of these churches during the height of the HIV/AIDS epidemic and pandemic within the Black community. So we lost entire churches. The other thing, a lot of these churches were house churches. There were churches that existed in the homes of individuals, were founded by husbands or founded by wives. Another thing that's very interesting that I found in the data about these congregations is that often that they were Pentecostal. And I am trying to figure out what is so attractive about Pentecostalism to Black queer folk, especially considering the fact that the majority of the persons that I have interviewed over my sort of 7 years of doing this research have come out of Black Baptist churches. I think that should say something as to why I'm giving this lecture in this Baptist space. All right. So, that's the sort of history of these churches. That will be the first chapter of this new book that's going to be titled A Black Queer Theological Primer. Tonight, I want to talk, though, about two gifts that come out of these contexts: Black queer hermeneutics and Black queer homiletics. So that's my preface. Two of the most significant Black ecclesial creations within Black queer churches started by Black queer folk are Black queer hermeneutics and Black queer homiletics. Black transgender and Black queer preachers are transformative voices in the wilderness, employing Black queer hermeneutics and homiletics to pave the way for the Lord's coming in the lives of Black queer folk. Black queer hermeneutics and homiletics not only challenge colonialist-derived norms, but also foster dialogue, meaning-making, and the expansion of perspectives in the souls of Black queer folk. Black queer hermeneutics and homileticians realize that Black queer folk already live in hell in the here and now, so why preach about a metaphorical hell in the life after? Instead, they preach until heaven comes to earth, even if only for a moment. Black queer transgender preachers and facilitate new interpretations of sacred texts centering on the intersectional dimensions of race, sexuality, and spirituality. This evening's lecture will examine how Black queer preachers and Black queer churches embrace unique forms of hermeneutics and homiletics to enable pride, to curate celebration, to assist with the navigation and negotiation of one's queer existence while valuing their identities through self-love, and all the while resisting and risking their own flesh just to breathe. That's what Black queer preaching does. It resurrects and helps people to breathe. It resurrects and brings spices to your tomb. Black queer preaching is a miracle working miracles. Black queer preaching teaches and aids black queer Christians to breathe, and by doing so, they profoundly transform the entire human religious landscape. But most importantly, black queer hermeneutics and homiletics provide black queer Christians with the theological imagination and biblical tools to explore and define God and their own existence for themselves. This is what they do. But what are they? What are black queer hermeneutics and homiletics? Well, I'm glad you asked. Black queer hermeneutics are interpretive methods that center social reform and prioritize the experiences and perspectives of black queer folk. On the other hand, black queer homiletics is a black queer technology. It is an art form. It is the science of black queer preaching from and in a perspective that integrates and centers blackness, queerness, and the erotic as an experience, as an identity, as an insight, while also questioning and dismantling structures of oppression such as xenophobia, racism, homophobia, and transphobia. Black queer homiletics are linguistic methods of meaning making that repetitiously and poetically advocate for social justice and liberation while using techniques that appear violent and secular to the heteronormative. But such is the nature of both of these methods, a nature that not all black queer preachers embody. By this, I mean that a preacher who identifies as black and queer does not automatically imply that they are using black queer hermeneutics or homiletics. It is possible for black queer preachers to replicate the trash that was handed to them and to live into such. A black queer individual can still embody oppressive homiletics and hermeneutical methods as an overseer on this white American heteronormative plantation in North America. For the sake of time, and so that you can at least have a basic understanding of black queer hermeneutics and homiletics after this lecture, I want to spend just a bit of time thinking through these two categories. So let's start with black queer hermeneutics. Black queer hermeneutics is a rich and multidimensional interpretive method that centers blackness, queerness, and the erotic as experiences and realities that are ripe for meaning-making and philosophical conjecture. Black queer hermeneutics celebrates the black, the queer, and the erotic as a vital aspect of human possibility and spiritual life where reasoning, critical thinking, and illogical analysis challenges oppressive norms. I describe them as illogical. I know that's a little jarring, but I describe them that way because they break away from conventional patterns and norms, allowing for new ideas and perspectives to emerge, providing liberative and expansive readings of the world, history, its cultures, and the many human texts, both secular and sacred, that exist within the world. Black queer hermeneutics affirm and empower black queer flourishing and give priority to the cultural, historical, and social context of black queer secular communities, emphasizing the indistinguishability between the secular and the sacred. Black queer hermeneutics challenge conventional assumptions about black gender and black sexuality, interrogating the dominance of black cisgender and black heterosexual norms while embracing a wide range of what it means to be black and human. Black queer hermeneutics also celebrates the innate queerness of blackness. This perspective highlights how blackness itself can be seen as inherently queer in the sense that it often challenges and exists outside dominant cultural norms and expectations. By embracing the fluidity, resilience, and multiplicity of black identities, black queer hermeneutics celebrates how blackness resists and refines the conventional categories, creating a rich, inclusive, and dynamic understanding of both black and queer experiences. Black queer hermeneutics also celebrate the black erotic as a space of Black life, Black learning, Black joy, Black connection, Black pleasure, and Black empowerment, rejecting the feelings of shame that is often associated with the celebration of one's own body through masturbation, and embracing the richness of human pleasure through self-stimulation and the sharing of that pleasure with others in pairs or in groups. Black queer hermeneutics perceives the erotic as a force that brings about transformation imbued with sacredness, breaking down artificial divisions between the sacred, the mundane, and what is often categorized as the profane or the pornographic. Black queer hermeneutics have extremely interwoven relationships, though, with Black queer ethics. I'm now borrowing from a leader in my field, Nikki Young. Black queer theologians, also Black queer politics, Black queer theory and praxis. For example, Black queer hermeneutics shape and are shaped by Black queer theologies. Black queer hermeneutics not only help in interpreting existing Black queer ethical frameworks, but Black queer hermeneutics also constructs new Black queer ethics. Black queer hermeneutics provide theoretical backbones for Black queer politics by offering critical frameworks for understanding and articulating the complexities and politics of Black queer identities and experiences. But for the sake of this evening's Baptist time constraints, I want to narrow in on how I'm conceptualizing Black, queer, and erotic. Black queer hermeneutics are first and foremost Black. But what is Black or Blackness? As Elise Eve Wellenbaum argues, Blackness is an imaginatively resourceful counterclaim to the legalized thefts and systemic denigrations through which racism has been constituted and practiced. Blackness is a structure of feeling, end quote. In Black queer hermeneutics, Blackness is a worldview that centers on the Black experience as innately queer. In the tradition of Victor Anderson and my friend Calvin Warren, this queer type of Blackness goes beyond ontological understandings of being that have traditionally trapped Blackness into racial rhetoric that it did not create and which cannot serve Blackness in any meaningful way, i.e. the politics of respectability, borrowing from Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham. The Blackness that I refer to this evening is a sort of queer Blackness that moves beyond the cult of Black heteronormative heroic figures like Martin King and Malcolm X only into what Bell Hooks termed as postmodern Blackness. The queer Blackness that I speak of in this evening's lecture centers on a type of racial discourse that leaves room to negotiate African American identities along the lines of class, gender, sexuality, and age, as well as race. This is what I mean by Black. I am being very intentional about not writing to, and I'm not being shady here, but I'm just being informative, not writing to a Black upper middle class CME context or Methodist context, but directly towards an expansive understanding of Blackness that isn't limited by politics and respectability. Now, but not only are Black queer hermeneutics Black, but second, they are queer, meaning that they are not usual or typical. Black queer hermeneutics are queer in that they exist and thrive outside of the norm. Black queer hermeneutics are ways of life that cannot and should not be reduced to the categories of pleasure, identification, or a way of expressing oneself. The queerness within Black queer hermeneutics is much more than a category of personal specification about with whom one has sex. The queerness within Black queer hermeneutics is what constitutes its worldview or liberative way of living that produces a type of subversive confidence that begets personal, theological, and political intolerances for heteronormativity. It is also important to note that the queerness of Black queer hermeneutics is indistinguishable from the Blackness of Black queer hermeneutics. They are inextricably linked. The next piece I want to talk about is the erotic aspect of Black queer hermeneutics. Audre Lorde's theory of the erotic, as presented in her seminal work, The Uses of the Erotic as Power, offers a powerful lens through which to explore Black queer hermeneutics. Lorde teaches us that eroticism and intimacy transcend mere physical desire. They inhabit spiritual planes of deep joy, peace, prayer, worship, and play. And I just want to say that it is intentional that I am waiting until the section in my book around erotics to talk about the spirit. These elements coexist and intersect in ways that defy the rigid categorizations imposed by societal norms. In this way, prayer, worship, eroticism, and intimacy are one and the same. They are interconnected, each utilizing the body as a conduit for deeper spiritual expression. Lorde reclaims the erotic as a source of creative energy and empowerment, particularly for women, allowing them to assert control over their bodies and histories. She distinguishes between the erotic and the pornographic, emphasizing that the former, the pornographic, the erotic, is a positive force that connects deeply with the spiritual dimensions of individuals. Integrating Lorde's insights, Black queer hermeneutics can be understood as deeply erotic, spiritual, and salvific. The erotic in this context is not limited to physical desire, but encompasses a whole sense of self and the self's sensorium, not denying any aspect of the emotional dimensions. It is about intentionally integrating the erotic into the everyday, while recognizing it as a source of power and resilience, but not avoiding its pleasure. In the realm of Black queer hermeneutics, the erotic becomes a tool for interpreting even scripture, reclaiming the eroticism within the sacred text as also being just that, sacred. So now I want to end by having just a few remarks around Black queer homiletics, because after all, preaching is what we do. We use the hermeneutical lens in order to merge it with the art form to declare the word of the Lord. Black queer homiletics is a multifaceted and intersectional approach to preaching and Christian education that combines style and queer pedagogies and queer colloquialisms and culturally subversive language and advocacy in conversation with biblical text. Black queer homiletics moves beyond the Western and colonialist focus on Bible only as the sacred text and the final and only word of God, and embraces the idea that God is still speaking in our narratives. Black queer homiletics takes very seriously the Black queer experience as a living epistle to be read by humans. As a form of ecclesial advocacy and public witness, Black queer homiletics mobilizes congregations for activism by highlighting the intersections of racism, sexuality, faith, and social justice. The first, as an avid observer and curator and researcher of Black queer folk preaching, I have identified several consistent homiletical characteristics. The first characteristic is intersectionality. Black queer homiletics center on the intersecting identities of race, sexuality, and gender, using these perspectives as lenses to put a particular flair onto the preaching of the gospel. The second characteristic is that most Black queer homileticians are narrative-based in their approach. And some, God rest his soul, my preaching professors, Reverend Charles Gilchrist Adams and also the Reverend Peter Gomes would probably be a little concerned about making one's narrative the center of the sermon instead of the sacred text. But it is nevertheless a characteristic of Black queer preaching. Narratology becomes actually a form of resistance within Black queer homiletics, which often which homiletics can sometimes lean in towards this concept of literalism. By sharing personal and communal stories, preachers and theologians challenge dominative narratives that have historically marginalized or erased the Black queer experience. Now, some of the models that I'm going to use to sort of make the hermeneutics and homiletics sort of touch the ground are as follows. There are 4 homiletical models. The first one is the ballroom or house scene homiletical model. And I just want to say that I am intentionally not going to be using what we would consider to be the traditional preacher to develop this homiletical method. And that becomes a sort of queering of even the field of homiletics itself. The ballroom and house scene, and then 3 pivotal figures. One who does fit into the traditional preaching role, that's Pauli Murray. Second is Marsha P. Johnson, and third is the one and only James Baldwin, who many don't know was also a preacher, and many people think that he stopped preaching in his adulthood, but that's actually not true. He preached a revival for Walter Fluker when he was pastoring a church in Springfield, Massachusetts for 3 years in a row. So let me just give a quick little thing on the ballroom. The ballroom and house scene emerged in the Black and Latinx LGBTQIP plus communities of New York in the late 20th century, providing a platform for queer individuals, particularly those of color, to express themselves through dance, fashion, and performance. My understanding of Black homiletics is deeply influenced by the vibrant Black ballroom scene, a subculture born within the queer community in New York. The scene is celebrated through balls. The scene celebrates its community through balls, where participants showcase their identities in dance, fashion, and performance, creating a supportive environment for marginalized identities, especially queer, trans, and gender nonconforming individuals. The figure that I focus on, though, in this chapter on the ballroom is the MC, who is central to the events. If you have watched the FX show Pose, the MC would be the character Pray Tell in the show, who is played by the legendary actor Billy Porter. The MC, who is central to these events, not only energizes the crowd, but also weaves a narrative that blends affirmation, resistance, and community storytelling in the context, echoing the role of the Black preacher. Now, I want to say that the argument within the ballroom scene is that the MC is borrowing from the Black preacher tradition. And I am making an argument that all of these are interconnected, that it is possible for us all to learn from each other, that perhaps going to the old landmark is going to the landmark that was deemed the non-landmark because it didn't look like the original place. This connection is mirrored in Black queer homiletics, where the dynamic and interactive nature of the ballroom with its call and response and expressive movements inspires this approach in sermons in a lot of these Black queer affirming churches started by Black queer folk. You even hear the syncopated beats of house music being woven into traditional gospel songs within these contexts in the form of what is now called click tracks, where you hear this syncopated beat before the song starts. I remember the first time our musicians tried this at our church, people were looking around like, oh, what's going on? Is the building falling apart? It's a very syncopated beat, but this not only exists within the music, the traditional musicality of these spaces, but then it goes into the throat of the preachers within these spaces, in which they're echoing the Black preaching tradition, but also the MC tradition within the ballroom scene. It's a very beautiful thing that, for me, one of the things that I talk about in this chapter is how it is reminiscent of how, when the drum was outlawed in the antebellum South, that black preachers put that cadence in their throat in the form of what is now called hooping. This cadence, this conversation, this relationship, this erotic experience that happens in black preaching that causes this ecstatic release, almost some type of an orgasm in the hearts of those in the pews. This same type of energy and charisma and expressive style, and even the pizzazz, if you will, is visibly present within these black queer ecclesial spaces, where, after all, the rich tradition of the church queen is alive and well. And also, I want to say that that in its conception, the ballroom culture has also enriched the American and Black American lexicon with art forms like voguing, and also etymologically words like shade, reading, and fierceness. In this next book, I use these terms to actually describe what black queer hermeneutics do. Black queer homiletics and hermeneutics are shady. They are shady towards exclusionary doctrines, traditional norms, institutionalized homophobia, superficial piety, and systemic injustices. I also say that what black queer homiletics do is that they read. They read oppressive scriptures, conservative interpretations, and patriarchal biases and cultural insensitivities as oppressive as what they are. And I then go on to describe them as being extremely fierce. I won't go into that piece. I'll move quickly to talk a little bit about Pauli Murray. In Pauli Murray's work, one of the things that I try to lean into is the idea of intersectional advocacy, and the way that Anthony Penn just recently published a collection of Pauli Murray's sermons. And when you read through them, you will see the interesting connection that she had between faith and law. One of the things that many people don't know about Pauli Murray is that she is really responsible for the legislation that became involved in the Brown versus Board of Education. Which one little historical part that you may have read within my book, the basement of Union United Methodist Church here in Boston was where the NAACP sort of met to begin the sort of drafting of that document. But the truth is that they took a large chunk of it from Pauli Murray's Howard University Law School theses. And so we see that legal rhetoric evident within her preaching, because she saw that interweaving as being very important for preaching actually being successful in trying to dismantle aspects of empire. She says, she really reveals to us that there must be a combination with both. And I argue that this is important for black queer homiletics as a sort of technology and tool because of things such as what's happening in Florida, and the sort of legal dynamics and attacks that are presently going on to and towards the LGBTQIA+ community. The Marsha P. Johnson model. Marsha P. Johnson was a black transgender activist and drag queen who co-founded the activist group Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, called STAR. And it is sort of her street evangelism that I lean into. Another thing that I lean into with her work is the way that she curated spaces of grief for black, queer, and trans persons in New York who were trying to process the excessive rate of deaths and murders of black, queer, and trans persons at that particular time. This is where I lean into sort of a homiletical method for writing out eulogies. And then for James Baldwin, I look at James Baldwin's mastery of language and how it serves as a powerful model for black queer homiletics, particularly for black preachers, black queer preachers, and anyone wishing to adopt his approach. His ability to speak truth with beauty, with power, and with grace offers a technology, a tool, a path for preachers who seek to engage both the margin and the center. This is what I felt like he did quite well, coming from the margins, speaking to the center while also remaining relevant to the new burgeoning margins. His language was also very rich and lyrical and direct. I think these are all technologies that can be used. So I'll end, honestly, every Baptist preacher needs 3 closes. This is really my final one. Black queer preachers and speakers are, in my opinion, voices crying out in the wilderness, like John the Baptist preparing the way of the Lord. Their powerful and transformative methods emphasize visibility, authenticity, intersectional advocacy, and they pave the way for all preachers. In their cry, they herald the coming of a just and equitable society, eating wild honey and locusts, following in the footsteps of Marsha P. Johnson and the unapologetic truth-telling akin to James Baldwin, and fostering dialogue and solidarity like the ballroom scene and community. Black queer preachers transcend superficial literalist preaching to get to the heart of the matter, and we can learn from them. Thank you for listening.